Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Tanisha Sullivan, your host. Tonight, Black and Gay and Living in Massachusetts. This month marks the 20th anniversary of the legalization of same-sex marriage in Massachusetts. It was a significant civil rights victory for the LGBTQ+ community, the Commonwealth, and our nation. But for Black folks in the LGBTQ+ community, racism, discrimination, and the continued lack of understanding about intersectionality remains a major issue. What needs to change? Has living in Massachusetts provided opportunities, or is there still much more work to do? Joining us tonight to discuss, Corey Yarbrough is an LGBTQ+ advocate and the executive director of 826 Boston, an organization supporting K-12 students and beyond to share their stories, amplify their voices, and develop as leaders in school and in life. He was also the executive director of the Hispanic Black Gay Coalition, an organization he co-founded with his husband Quincey Roberts Sr. from 2009 to 2016. Reverend Irene Monroe is a speaker, an LGBTQ+ activist, public theologian, and the co-host of The Revs on GBH Boston Public Radio and the podcast All Rev'd Up. Shaplaie Brooks is the executive director of the Massachusetts Commission on LGBTQ+ Youth. And Justice Roe Williams, a board member of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition. He is also a body-positive activist with Fitness for All Bodies and the co-editor of the book, Deconstructing the Fitness Industrial Complex, How to Resist, Disrupt, and Reclaim What It Means to Be Fit in American Culture. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. This is certainly a monumental time as we look forward to celebrating, commemorating, I'll say, the 20th anniversary of marriage equality here in Massachusetts, which we know helped to usher in marriage equality across our country. Yet still today, we know that the fight for marriage equality continues around the world. And so I want to thank you in advance, before we get into the conversation, all of you, for the work that you've done, for the role that you've played to help advance this movement. So let's get into it. Reverend Monroe, Reverend Irene.
There you go. Okay.
I really want us to go back. Because you have been so actively involved in the movement here in Massachusetts. And can you talk a little bit about just the work that led up to the Goodrich decision in 2003, which ushered in the legalization of gay marriage in Massachusetts on May 17th, 2004.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. Well, it's interesting. Massachusetts at one time didn't think we were going to actually be marshalling in gay marriage. We actually thought it was going to be New Hampshire. At one point, we thought it was going to be Hawaii. But once it came into our lap, we ran with the baton here and stuff. But one of the things that was very wonderful at the time, we had a very activist Supreme Court in our favor here. We get gay marriage, I have to say, because of Deval, Governor Deval Patrick, I need to say, because, you know, the former governor, which was Mitt Romney, definitely would have voted against it. And one of the things that had to be done was to get all the communities, because, again, we're a very diverse community. We're a very segregated community. Even today here is to bring everybody to the table. And so the marriage equality didn't start on a good note here. You know, Black and brown LGBTQIA communities were not in the conversation, but with a kind of wrestling and that we had with GLAAD and other power brokers around gay marriage, it brought some of us on to the table. Because one of the things that we said, we know that you you are definitely building your case on Mildred Loving versus the Commonwealth of Virginia that allowed for interracial marriage. But the point is that you can appropriate, meaning black people's achievement, but not deal with our problems. And living at the intersection, gay marriage is certainly one of the issues on the table, but so too is HIV/AIDS for us. We've had, and that was still very rampant in our community, although the larger dominant community felt that the AIDS crisis was over.
And so when you think about that moment when the decision was handed down, can you just take us back to the feeling?
Oh, I was quite elated. I must tell you. I mean, because at the day of it, it's like it builds on the Board of Education.
Yes.
Okay, so we got to remember all the legal sort of landmarks. And you're the attorney, so you can expound much better. But it's building again on all the achievements of black and brown people, but yet not have us there only for photo op moments become problematic here and stuff. But I was very happy about it. But still, for the work of all of you, we now have a much more robust voice, much more visibility in bringing this to the type of intersectionality that needs to be, parceled out in the community. We still wrestle with that. We still wrestle with it. But there are many more of us. When I came around, it was just me, then all of a sudden Corey showed up, and then you showed up. So it's just so wonderful.
Yes, and I think, that piece there about how so much of the advancement of many of the civil rights movements in this country have been based on the advancement of black rights in this country, the advancement of, some may say civil rights, we're going to talk about black rights, the advancement of black people in this country, the fight of black people in this country. And yet, when we're talking about many of these movements, gender rights, LGBTQ rights, we are not centered as a people. Can you talk, Corey, a little bit about the work that we have to do to ensure that black voices are not just heard, but are a part of the conversations?
Sure. I mean, that is part of my journey and experience moving to Boston. I think what attracted me to come to Boston was marriage equality. But then when I got here, I realized it was a little complicated, and it was a little complicated for a young black gay boy in Boston. And I found it very difficult to find a home in white communities that were just looking to fetishize my body because I was the new black face in town, and difficulty navigating black spaces because I would get stares or lectures, if I wanted to hold my partner's hand, at events or in public. And so I think that need sparked the Hispanic Black Gay Coalition, which was a by us for us approach to meet the needs of the Black and LGBT community here in Boston, provide our own social support, provide our own leadership and visibility within the community. And we need more of that today for all the reasons Reverend Irene was discussing, because there are other disparities that our community still face beyond marriage. HIV is one, but education is another. We experience disproportionate dropout rates in schools and college-going rates, and employment discrimination, housing discrimination. You can go on and on and on. So who is advocating for those issues? And when you intersect that with communities of color, it becomes more difficult to access the support and services that we need.
Some people may say, how is it possible that that members of the LGBTQ plus community could be experiencing discrimination? Some people might not quite understand. And so can you talk a little bit more about kind of how that shows up?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it shows up in every aspect of my life. And again, it's not just whether you are getting a racial slur here or there or a homophobic slur here or there. There are systems that have been intentionally built to exclude us and to discriminate against us. When, I call my healthcare provider and I can't get a black doctor, that is a part of the problem. Or if I'm able to get a black doctor, he is not competent in my sexuality or gay health, essentially. That is a part of the problem. All of that has the potential to take years off of my life, right? If I am going in for an interview and I can't come how I want to come and present myself the way I want to present, or talk about what my husband means to me, or put a picture up of my family, or without facing, discrimination or the fear of exclusion or discrimination in the workplace, that hinders my livelihood and my happiness. And so it's hard to answer that question because, again, I could go on and on and on because it intersects with my everyday life.
And thank you, Corey, for that piece because Justice, one of the things that you shared earlier was that being here in Massachusetts and some of what was happening in just the community actually led you to feel comfortable enough to come out. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Thank you for having me. I feel like Massachusetts is a different place. I came from New Jersey, Atlantic City, New Jersey. And in coming to Massachusetts, it was kind of like for me, if you think about Alice in Wonderland, and she fell in a hole, right? I fell in a hole and I'm like, what exactly? Everything's opposite. Things are not making sense. Things that are small are big. Things that are big are small, right? And, I look at things like education, like they say, it's different here. Like they'll say, oh, education, but then they have MECO. And I look at MECO as busing. Like I think of it as taking our young people out of areas where we are community, we are connected, we are powerful individuals, and placing them under duress, under trauma, right, in violent situations, in the name of better education, where are the funds going in this very liberal state, right? I think about that a lot. And I think about, my experience as a black man, of trans experience here, and just not fitting into one space, but jumping in and out of other communities that are connected to my identity, right? So, fighting for political prisoners, my activism, fighting for poor communities here, always in Roxbury, doing youth work, doing sex work, right? But jumping into communities that erase my transness, that erase my queerness, and I'm centered in black communities where these discussions aren't happening, right? And that's the thing about whiteness. It's about distancing ourselves even from our own bodies so that we feel foreign within. And that happens here a lot in Boston.
Can you talk a little bit about Rita Hester?
Yes. Rita Hester is the reason I had to find my authenticity. Watching black people dying at a disproportionate rate. I'm watching black trans women dying at a disproportionate rate. And when Rita died, I wasn't out. At that time, people would call me a gender workshop, because I would talk to people interpersonally about my experience that felt safe for me. But I felt like it was a white thing to put a flag on my head and say, oh, I'm trans, right? But I had to do that. I had to do that to speak my authentic truth to communities that I was an activist in. And so when Rita Hester died, I had to figure out a way where I could connect all of the intersectionality in my body, in my community as a black people, and share the story of who we are in wholeness, not in that distancing that happens where we begin to hate ourselves. Parents are hating children because they're queer or because they're trans, when we have been existent within the black community historically, you said, right, since slavery, right? We've always been a part of our black community. And so in '98, I decided to put myself together. So I organized the Truth Rally, which I feel like changed the climate for trans people here and queer people, because we're pulling political prisoners to march, right? And we're pulling youth to march, right? That wouldn't normally be a part of these discussions, right?
No, keep going.
No, in that collecting and cultivating of community, pulling all these communities together under one common collective goal, which was the media lies about all of our experience.
So on that note, I'm going to come to Shaplaie, but I'd love to get reactions from others, and would love to talk a little bit about kind of the role of media, and particularly when we talk about our youth today. The youth have become masterful when it comes to understanding media and really leveraging it to tell a story. In your work with our young people today, how are you seeing them use media to really help advance the movement?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting and very loaded question, especially, thinking about Basic Black. So with the commission, there are many movements that have come out of, we've been around for 32 years, and we've had some national LGBTQ youth organizations come from us, which is incredible, right? And at the same time, there is this kind of othering of young Black people. And when you think of what is happening in the media, there is this, it's beautiful, right? When you think of the TikTok, and you think of Facebook and Instagram and all the things that young people can do with it, I often think about who's being left out of that, and, the path that they kind of have to create for themselves. And so at the commission, coming to the commission, for me was, I want to make sure that, yes, we've already been doing really great work, but who is not centered in that work? And I often talk about the marginalized community within the marginalized community, and how do we center those voices, and how do we make sure that they are at the forefront? What I still see is, I mentioned this earlier, the attaching agendas to identities. And so you'll see Black and brown youth who are in media, all because their white friends are pushing them to the front, because there is this LGBTQ struggle, but there is also this we want to take Black stories out of school. We want to take LGBTQ stories out of schools, and so I find that it is a beautiful way to push the movement forward, and at the same time, they learn from their parents, right? They've learned to then also center the wrong voices, but push Black people to the front just to get their voices heard. So we have done a lot around young people thinking about how they are able to look at their own identities and not weaponize those identities when we're calling them out on some of those things, right? Not weaponizing your identity as one person who has mental health issues or a person who is trans, and using that to absolve you from the racism that is happening. So when you think of that, we want to center that, and we want to talk about that in the media while we continue to push that forward. So that's some of the work that we've been doing with young people to make sure they're actually doing the work in a very intersectional way.
Absolutely. There's so much power, as we all know, in media and in storytelling. And there's an African proverb that says, until the lion begins to write, the story will always glorify the hunter. And so I do want to, Reverend Irene, talk a little bit about telling our stories, because when no matter what the movement is, from a civil rights standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, race and racism consistently end up as a stumbling block. And so what is the power in our storytelling?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. What I've done is really have written for a number of these queer papers here in Massachusetts as well as across the country, because it's sort of like getting the word out or getting the gospel out. But I always remember what Toni Morrison says here: if you don't see it, you need to do it. So in many ways, it's writing ourselves in history and writing ourselves in existence here. And who controls the pen controls the narrative.
Yes.
And I'll give you just a quick example of that, just two. One of which, when we think of the Stonewall riot here, and I need to say I'm old enough to have been down there and stuff, but when you look at that narrative here, it has bleached out Black and brown working class bodies here. So you would think that there was a white movement. Also, when you look at the photos, you don't see us. largely because our riots, and this is 1969 here, our riots usually take place in our communities. We went down to those communities to get who we had to get and bring back home safely. We don't have the luxury that we're going to fight the police. That's absurd, because we wouldn't do that now. But I grew up with the Amsterdam News. I didn't read the New York Times growing up. I knew the importance of telling our news, because what happens even in our queer papers, and I don't want to call them out, there's a queer racial trope. Yeah. And if it isn't about pain, suffering, poverty, ignorance, you know, and being uneducated, then why would we be there other than for a photo op moment? And even in those narratives, that's when we're front and center. Mm-hmm. So it was important to tell our story.
Mm-hmm. In telling our story, I think one of the stories that, you know, is still being written when it comes to telling our story as it relates to the LGBTQ plus movement is the relationship between the Black church and the LGBTQ community. It's an evolving story. And I do want to, you know, I'd love to hear kind of from your perspectives how it has evolved or not. And where you're hoping it will go. I'll start with you, Corey, because you have, you know, there's some joy in your relationship.
Right. I was going to say we need to tell the stories of joy and the stories of leadership to inspire others to continue to blaze their own trail. And so, you know, my experience with the Black church evolved as well, but I'll fast forward to my adult life and getting married. My partner and I, Quincey, served in a church for years, even operated our nonprofit from the church for a few years. But when it was time for us to get married and us wanting to get married in that church, which was a historically Black church in the South End, all of a sudden it was a problem. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, 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 before the eyes of God, you all want to do this? And so we literally had to go through a deliberation with the trustees of the church, and they had to vote on whether our love was worthy in the eyes of God and whether we could walk down those aisles like many heterosexual couples had done for years. And long story short, obviously we did get married in that church. They voted in favor of us, enough did at least. And we were able to break down that door. And, you know, I'm proud of that, not because we were the first, but because we weren't the last. And other people didn't have to go through that fight. There no longer had to be another vote. There have been many queer couples who have gotten married in that church. And so to do that in a historically Black church and to be the third, I believe, in that denomination in the country to be gay married is an accomplishment I'm proud of.
Shaplaie, what's your just reflection when it comes to the evolution of the relationship between the Black church and the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, growing up at PK, I mean, Pentecostal PK storefront, lived upstairs. Mother was a bishop, in church 24/7. That was an experience. And I think how it has evolved is honestly, I think there is more acceptance. And if we're honest, right, which I really try to be transparent and very honest, it's really about like who's bringing the money to the church, right? And because I mean, there are so many people leaving the church now, right? And young people are leaving, and we're all leaving for a number of different reasons, right? You think about church hurt, and as a Black queer woman myself, and growing up in the church, that wasn't allowed, right? And to know now that there were so many people hiding. There were so many people hiding in the church. But even to know that some of our, I mean, we often think of like our choir directors and, you know, and all of that. And you look at them and you're like, I remember Aaron. Like, I remember, that was my baby, but I remember, like, and it is, you felt this familiarity with them. I think it's evolved in a way as well, because you think about what love looks like. That's right. That's right. And that's the first, I think a lot of Black people are starting to distance themselves from whiteness, right? And how whiteness has infiltrated our faith. And so what is love? How do we start there? And if I could just show you love, right? If I could just, my mother used to often say, like, with love and kindness have I drawn thee, right? And also, like, if you want to be a friend, show yourself friendly. And so if we want people to stay in the church and we want people to really be a part of the faith, the first thing we have to do is start with love. And love wins, right? In all circumstances. So
love wins.
Amen.
Joy, love. When we have our final few moments, and so I do want to, Reverend Irene, can't close this topic out without giving you an opportunity to speak to kind of where we're going from a relationship between faith and the community.
Well, I need to say we're becoming more open and affirming. I think that many black churches understand this, that gay people love Jesus just as much as straight people. So they no longer use this theological qualifier to love the sinner and hate the sin. And they realize we're not children of a lesser God. We're children of the same God.
Amen. I started at the beginning thanking each of you for the work that you have done, that the work that you continue to do in this fight to advance, yes, LGBTQIA+ rights, but for civil rights and for human rights, generally speaking. So thank you, and it has been an honor to be with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thank you to all of our guests, and thank you for watching. Now stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, YouTube and Facebook. I'm Tanisha Sullivan, your host. We are on YouTube and Facebook with our post show, continuing our discussion on Black and Gay and living in Massachusetts. We have been having, I think, a vibrant conversation that I'm actually very curious to learn more about. And that's specifically around how Black folks within the community have, over the course of time, chosen to identify ourselves. How we have kind of taken ownership of who we are and how we are defined. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. You know, one of the things is in terms of naming ourselves, when you say, you know, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersectional. And so I'm coming up at a time when you have this dominant white, you know, LGBT community defining what it meant to be lesbian, to be gay, to be, you know, bisexual, be trans here. And so we have terminology. We've always had terminology. We would say stuff like in the life. We would say same gender loving, you know, men loving men here. Again, it was a counter narrative, a counter narrative to sort of deconstruct what I call the white queer cisgender hegemony that not only shapes in defining us, but also stereotyping us.
Yeah, we have a lot of that in our community, like you were saying. I mean, we talk about all the time studs and femmes and how we embrace that, right? And even that we talked about masculinity and how it's kind of like infiltrated every space that we've been in earlier. And even we have to own even how that infiltrates even in the lesbian space, right? With studs and femmes. And I often try to say that I'm STEMmy, but I'm probably not. But right? But
what does that mean?
To be a STEM is this mixture of both masculine and feminine traits, right? And I think I'm STEM. I mean, I now own like 6 pairs of sneakers, so please. But it is not, you know, when you think of me in a Black queer community, you would consider me a femme. I have my nails done, I'm all made up, and I'm doing all the femme things, right? My gender expression aligns with my gender identity. When you see a masculine of center Black woman, their gender identity may not match what you think. And most Black women in our community, they would say, oh, I'm a stud. And many Black women don't want to say that I'm a stud, right? Because there is that toxic masculinity that is attached to being a stud, right? And we can go on. And this is an incredible conversation. But even how whiteness has kind of infiltrated that space as well, and those like white supremacy culture and paternalism and all of that, right, and this toxic masculine culture. But yes, we have taken back, right, we've taken back our identity, and we've begun to name ourselves. We're not butch, we're studs, right? We're femmes, and we love that space, right? And we're proud of that space. And we also don't do it with our sexuality, right? You can have a stud woman with a stud woman, and it is our business, right? And it doesn't have to be stud and femme to match this heterosexual idea of love, right? So yeah, I love that conversation for sure.
There's a quote that I made from my book.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
That whiteness is always in a space, even if there's not one white person in the room, right? So from that quote, it speaks to my identity growing up, right? And I often talk about having to jump in and out of boxes, right? And this jumping in and out of boxes has separated me from myself, has created like emotional trauma, has created even the ways that my parents love me, right? It's about preparing me for a world that has erased me and don't want me in it, right? And so, and I don't want that to be misconstrued, because sometimes when we think through whiteness, we think that that is not accepting my queerness or not accepting my gayness. And that's not what's going on. It's protecting the one you love, right? Yeah. Because when Audre Lorde says, you know, it's the intersectionality, right? You know, if I'm thinking about all the intersections of who I am and I'm digging a grave, I might as well, you know, just jump in it, right? That's right? And so I decided not to jump in that grave. I decided to not be a part of a white supremacist culture that dissects me, right? I decided that my love, which is not perfect, looks like not being specialized, not being seen through your separation of my being. Bell Hooks says we live in a white supremacist. I added this cis hetero,
that's right,
patriarchal capitalistic society.
Amen.
Right? And that is infused in every institution, every relationship that we're all a part of on this land, this colonized land, right? And so I take that away, and I take that umbrella away, and the sunshine to me is love, right? Is that pulling myself together. I refuse to let my liberation mirror my oppression.
There you go. There you go. Right.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Powerful.
And we don't need to reinscribe it, you know, because a lot of times we do that trying to fit in, or thinking that within that troubled space we might be able to then identify ourselves, but we just get caught up in a trap, you know, and stuff. But I appreciate this. I really appreciate this conversation, because when I came out, you know, there was a certain kind of type or look to be a lesbian. I look nothing like that. I look nothing like Ellen. I love Ellen, by the way, but I look nothing like Ellen, you know, and I don't even dress like Ellen. So, you know, but what makes it makes me invisible, not only to myself, but to the Black community.
That's right.
You see?
Yeah, we were talking about that in media earlier, and it reminded me the very first time I saw queer man or gay man on TV, and you all may remember this, in Living Color, the Man on Film skits, right?
Okay.
That devastated me as a young boy, because I was like, oh, is this what it means to be gay? First, it means either to make people laugh or to be the butt of people's jokes. And I was just like, I don't want to be that. I can't be that.
Yeah.
And so does that mean I'm not gay, or am I a special type of gay, or do I have to be that because I am gay? So it just led to so many different identity questions, and I think that is why it's so important we reclaim our identities, and we have a multitude of examples to look to in terms of what is gay and what is queer, you know, to our community, to Black community especially.
I love that. And, you know, that's so important to our liberation, that we take ownership of defining who we are, and that we don't allow anyone else to do it to us, not for us, to us. So I love that. I also, you know, when I think about our movements, civil rights movements, human rights movements, we can't talk about it without getting into policy. Because that is how I believe, you know, we are really able to make the change through public policy, through changing of law that can direct action. And so, Shaplaie, can you talk a little bit about some of the public policy fights that are currently kind of on the agenda?
Yeah, I think we spoke to it, you know, when you think of bills or you think of policy changes and, you know, LGBTQ people, we often center, again, the white voices that are often in the room, right? The only seats in the room. And so we as Black people have to kind of like pull up our chair, park it there, create our own space at the table, move other things around and look at this. I remember first coming to the commission and the Gender X bill hit my desk and like, we want the commission's support. I'm like, absolutely. Of course we would support the Gender X bill. Let me read it. Let me look through it. And so when I looked through it, I thought to myself, well, on its face, this is beautiful, right? When you think of we want to make sure that anyone who wants to identify with an X on an X marker on our licenses, on anything else, on our marriage license, on our birth certificates, we can do that, right? Which is beautiful. But then I think about Black people, right? Black trans people, right? And then I think about, you have to think about how the systems have been designed to attack us, right? And there's where that intersectional identity comes into play. So what are the proactive, what are you doing proactively to make sure that we can track the discrimination or the harassment that Black gay people, Black queer people, Black trans people, Black non-binary people, gender diverse people are putting this X on that we are already being stopped by the police and being harassed by the police at a disproportionate rate. So now I wonder, what are we going to do proactively to make sure that we're not being even further marginalized because we've put an X on our marker? And so until you attach that to the bill, unfortunately, that's not something that we can support. And so when we're looking at the policy and legislation, we just need to make sure that we're showing up and people are at the table who are thinking about us as well. Because a queer issue is a queer issue is a queer issue, but also a Black issue is very different sometimes than a queer issue. And we need to be able to look at both, and we need to center both identities and the work that we're doing.
I think language, I just want to say, I think language traps us. And this is why I always like Alice Walker's term, womanist, because yes, we're feminists, okay, but it had a kind of dominance that you didn't see us. But when you talked about womanist, it brought us in. And so we see how the American, the lexicon fails us when we don't redefine it and find a way that certainly illuminates the truth of who we are.
Absolutely.
I think language is a tool of the oppressor.
For sure.
I think language is also a way of separating us from power, separating us from each other. And it forces us to think of language as one particular way when we can connect to each other in so many different ways beyond what we've been told that language is. When you think language, someone's always thinking about audible, right? And then if you're thinking audible, what about the communities, the part of our community that don't speak audibly, right? And so that's why I think I have a unique mind, because I think that in a white supremacist society, we do have to reframe things, right? We do have to make them authentic to our embodiment and who we are as a whole. We have to become whole. We have to heal, right? And I think that I'm often thinking about I think about this all the time. My blackness, my transness, my queerness, my poorness. You know, I'm always thinking about
we can't separate all of these pieces.
It's all of who I am.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
And so if I'm not recreating, if I'm not making space where we have the courage to recreate that, right, what that looks like.
So and one of the things that I want to make sure that we get time to talk about this because it's timely. The issue of missing Black women and girls. Okay. Nationwide issue here in the Commonwealth. We have legislation that is currently at the State House. We know that when it comes to Black women and girls, oftentimes we are not thought of. We are not looked for. We're not cared for. When we add on to that a conversation about trans women, Black trans women. I want to make sure that we're naming that issue as well because there is legislation currently moving, but also want to, in our final moments, just give the panel an opportunity to talk a little bit about this crisis, specifically as it relates to in trans youth, specifically as it Black trans youth, specifically as it relates to this crisis today.
Could I just start? Because I think this also connects to something I want to say on the last topic. Like, I am just sick and tired of being told to wait our turn. And I feel like, and false promises of being told to wait our turn, right? Because I feel like there was an environment around this even when marriage equality was being debated in terms of like, you know, we don't have time for this trans stuff. We don't have time for this POC stuff because we need to be all on board. We need you now to show up to these rallies to get marriage passed because that's what we're putting all our money behind and all of our political power behind. Marriage gets passed. What about our issues now?
That's right.
Oh, no, we're on to the next. We need to focus on this. We need to focus on that. And even when, you know, the LGBT community began to focus on trans issues, people of color were still left out. You weren't seeing them speaking or being invited to speak or their stories being empowered to, you know, move the political field forward. And so I am just waiting for a time where we can lead advocacy and our voices can be centered and our solutions and our ideas can be centered. And so I'll just start the conversation with that.
You know, the Combahee River Collective that started here in the 1980s was a group of lesbian women, and it's in its 50th anniversary. And it started because for a number of reasons, but one was because there were a number of murders in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, and they still are cold cases, like Rita Hester's case here and stuff. Gwen Eiffel, God bless her soul, brought the issue about missing Black women here. Make me think of Atlanta, the murders in Atlanta here, of the kids missing. And what happens is that we need policy, as you say here. We need law enforcement to be trained to look for Black bodies. But until I think as a community, and we get our lawmakers to really focus on this issue, we will still be invisible. And Black women are always collateral damage. It's always expendable because it's a whole idea that we probably were out walking.
That's right.
You know,
doing
something.
Existing.
That's right. Trying to anyway.
No, I just wanted to speak to that. We are advocating. We are fighting, right? It's just that we're erased from history. We're erased from the radical things like Stonewall, right? Even when it happened with Rita Hester, right? People don't believe me when I say, you know, that I organized this march. They believe that a white trans woman has organized it, and then the Day of Remembrance was based off of this white woman's work. But the Day of Remembrance actually was based off of that collaborative power, that collective power, right? That initiated and sparked a fire within white trans people who decided to step up and use their whiteness to create organizations, right, for trans people. And so there's that erasure from history. And because we're black, people don't believe us, right? So one of the things that I say, because I deeply love my people, and I deeply love my trans community, right? Deeply love. Everything that I do in this world is to deconstruct patriarchal masculinity and make the connections to the ways that it attacks us, it erases us, it separates us, and it's not our narrative, right? I always tell people, if we're looking for equity, if we create equity for black trans women in this world, we have created equity for everyone in this world.
All right, come on.
Everyone. And until people see that as our truth, our collective truth as black people, right? Our collective truth as communities within this country, larger, greater communities, then we won't be liberated. We won't be free. There will not be equity, right? So I just wanted to put that out there because I feel like people talk about it, they tap around it, but it's not authentically in their blood, in their survival mode, as a daily ritual of understanding that everywhere we go, we have to speak that truth to power.
Absolutely.
And you're gonna have the last word.
Yeah, I'll take it a step further. When I often say, you know, when you free the most marginalized person in the room, you free everyone else. But who is the most marginalized person in the room? It's your black trans woman who has an IQ below 70, who is in the child welfare system, who is multi-system involved. And we often talk about, you know, the lifespan of trans people, right? And we often do not speak about the youth who are going missing every single day from the child welfare system. And when in 2020 hit, I can give you story after story after story. Young immigrant women whose visas have run out and they're 18 and have signed themselves back into care, and they're like, well, how do I even get money now? What do I do? DCF had an priority and an obligation to make sure that their paperwork was in place, but they were not. So what did they do? I have to, as a immigrant trans woman, turn to sex work, or I go missing as a young person, or I'm running away from the system, and you can't find me. You haven't even put out a search for me because you want your bed to still be filled. And so it is about, I agree, making sure we're talking about who is the most marginalized person in the room, and we need to be speaking about that. And I am a person who will not shut up about that, period. You spoke about, you know, being a womanist, and I'm like, you cannot be black and queer and be a feminist. You cannot, because if you are a feminist, you are completely forgetting about the black trans woman and the black trans girl. And so for me, this is a powerful discussion, and when you think about missing children, I'm always saying no one's thinking about those black trans girls that go missing every single day. Every single day.
And they were missing in COVID.
Period.
Okay. Yep.
Powerful conversation indeed. I want to thank you all for staying with us for this portion of the show. Unfortunately, we do have to end it here. But again, thank you. I'm Tanisha Sullivan. I want to thank those of you who have joined us on our digital platforms. Thank you and have a great night.